The Trump administration releasing a brand new immigration plan to fulfill key campaign promises on securing the border and cracking down on illegal immigration, while also trying to solve the DACA problem, which so many people have been focusing on. But is that indeed a distraction? Joining us right now from Washington is Sarah Flores, the Director of Public Affairs for the Justice Department. Welcome, Sarah. Thanks for staying up late with us.
Great to be here.
I know the administration was focused on tax reform, and we thought after health care it was going to be one at a time. Why was it important to release an immigration plan as well?
Well, when the Attorney General found that DACA was simply not going to pass constitutional muster, the ball has moved to Congress's court. And I know that this president thinks that fixing our immigration system is a priority. He ran on that, and the American people clearly support him in that mission. And so he's letting Congress know what his priorities are, and they are important ones. This is E-Verify, not letting gang members into this country, ending sanctuary city policies, just to name a few examples.
And that's what he says he is going to do in exchange for getting the 800,000 that were brought here as children without any say in the matter, and now that they're young adults in many cases, giving them a pathway to citizenship, and that's been outlined in the Senate. But what the president's talking about, which I find most interesting, Sarah, is the fact that he dealt with law enforcement to consult them first instead of dealing with legislatures to see what past bills were about. How important was it to meet with the Border Patrol, to meet with the FBI, to go down there and talk to others when it comes to getting more judges, when it comes to more Border Patrol and more lawyers for these, in some cases, unaccompanied minors?
Well, what I don't think that a lot of people recognize is that these policies, or lack thereof, of a lawful system of immigration really affect our law enforcement communities. Let's take sanctuary cities, for example. When you don't allow federal law enforcement to pick up convicted criminals from the jail, you force them into these communities, surprising people and leaving law enforcement at risk. So a lot of these policies deeply affect law enforcement. It's very important to see what works for them, what doesn't work for them, and where they need the most help creating our lawful system of immigration and then maintaining it.
So Senator Schumer on the record saying we talked to the president at that dinner about a pathway to DACA, a compromise. He said we're willing to put in take in reasonable border security measures and illegal immigration measures. He says this is not reasonable. What do you say?
They're unable to point to what is actually unreasonable about this. What is unreasonable about having a lawful system of immigration? What is unreasonable about the 77% of Americans who think that we should end sanctuary city policies where a convicted criminal is left in your community after they've served their time when they should be deported? Look at the poor woman in Portland. That city harbored sanctuary policies, illegal aliens. The person who attacked her had been deported 20 times, arrested 10 times just this year before he attacked and raped a 65-year-old woman. Those are not policies that the American people support, and yet I have yet to hear opponents to these legislative priorities actually say why they're against them.
Sarah, I think it's also important to point out there's 70 points here. And in order to pass comprehensive immigration, which President Bush couldn't do, President Obama obviously couldn't do, President Reagan did, but he was let down because there was no border enforcement to go along with the amnesty. However, you need 60 votes. And as certain as you are that you're right and the president feels he's right, there's going to be some give and some compromise. Do you think that there's a sense on both sides that needs to be some compromise?
Absolutely. I think that these are the president's legislative priorities. They shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. This is what he ran on for president. It's what the American people elected him to do. This is about border security, yes, but it's also about interior enforcement. And it's about reforming our lawful system of immigration for legal immigration so that we're bringing the right people in. So I think that this is what he's coming to the table with. This is what he's saying. I represent the American people, and this is what they want. But ultimately, this is Congress's decision. This is their responsibility. And that's what we saw with DACA, where the last administration just declared themselves the legislative branch, and we can't have that anymore. So I think the president's well aware of the responsibility and duty that Congress has to act in this arena.
And I think it's important for people listening to us right now to understand that there was talk of there'll be border enforcement in the 80s with Reagan, and it didn't happen. In 2006, both sides said we wrote a check to build a fence, some type of barrier when necessary, and a wall when it works, and they never built it. So what language is in this to make sure people have to fulfill what they promised?
Right, and that's why I think the president thinks it's so important that these go hand in hand. You've got to have a secure border. You've got to have interior enforcement. You've got to fix the asylum system as it is, end sanctuary policies that create these perverse incentives. and then you can talk about these other fixes that that Congress wants. But it has to come together. You're right. The American people have been fooled in this before, and they simply won't accept it any longer.
Some numbers are staggering. I should inform you, and I'm sure you know this already, at least the audience maybe doesn't. This year alone, there have been 34,000 plus unaccompanied minors coming across our border. And this is a time in which the border crossings have been decreased. And there's a provision passed in 2008, I think in the last year of the Bush administration, correct me if I'm wrong, that allows anyone from Central America to stay here and get a ticket to come back for their hearing. But once they're crossed, they really can't be sent back. No one really knew what this was about. But, man, did we get to know this when we saw all these people surge across the border for seemingly no apparent reason.
And when the last administration highlighted that that would be their policy, particularly if you claimed any asylum or reasonable fear of return, what we saw was from 2009 to 2016, a over 1,000-point increase in the number of asylum seekers. So incentives matter. And when the last administration broadcast that we were going to essentially have an open borders policy, that is, in fact, what largely happened. And that's what this president has said he will not allow, that we will have rule of law and that we will have a lawful system of immigration that serves the national interest.
And when it comes to the DACA situation, will the president get Nancy Pelosi and Chuck back in to discuss this, or is it just go through the legislative process?
Well, I would never get ahead of the president when it comes to his negotiations, but I think that it's pretty clear from his legislative priorities that he laid out last night that he is serious about border security and interior enforcement and having a lawful system of immigration, which is why the American people overwhelmingly support those measures as well. And
we'll see what happens. And in some cases, there'll be a wall. In some places, there'll be a fence. And in other places, the topography doesn't allow for anything. So we'll see what happens. Sarah Flores, thanks so much. Appreciate it. It's going to be exciting to see if anything gets passed before the year's end. Appreciate it.
Thanks.